Welcome. I'm Jessica Tietjen, and this is the Evolving to Exceptional podcast, where we talk about reaching peak performance in our workplaces, homes, and communities so that we can live our best life possible, an exceptional life. Welcome back to this week's episode of the Evolving to Exceptional podcast. We have another fantastic guest, a global human resources leader, Lilya Joseph, who works for Square GPS, a fantastic organization that's done a lot of really great people work, and especially in the space of dealing with cross-cultural challenges and issues, as they are a global company with people in multiple different countries, and they have to navigate all the challenges that come from that type of global workforce. Lilya, I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about why you do what you do and how you got to where you are.
Thanks so much, Jessica. It's a pleasure being here. So just a brief overview about me. I've been in HR for a little bit over 7 years, since 2016. So far, I've changed 3 industries. I started in nonprofit, then worked in staffing, and now I'm in the IT space. So it's been 3 different experiences. But I think I discovered HR as my passion around 2016 when I realized that the thing that I most profoundly care about is people, and people interest me. And I had the curiosity about people and human nature since I was very young. So I went and got my master's in human resources from Washington University, graduated in 2019, increased my knowledge getting SHRM SCP certification. And since then, here I am today, work as HR manager for Square GPS. We are a global software company in telematics space. We produce software in telematics space, and it's been a really exciting journey. I focus on employee engagement, compliance across the Western hemisphere, building healthy workplace culture, of course, recruiting and all the things HR. Currently, my focus is working with employees in the United States and Mexico.
Lilya, you and I've talked before about some of the challenges that you've experienced as you have started work and worked for the last couple years for Square GPS. Tell me a little bit about what some of those challenges are and what you've experienced with respect to people and human resources and your business overall.
Yes, absolutely. So the company is not a startup. It's 18 years old, but since the company started expanding to different countries globally, it comes with its own pains from recruiting in the countries that you've never recruited before, finding the right people, following all the laws, establishing offices, communicating across time zones, dealing with different languages, different way of doing business, engaging people that have different values. So it's the list of challenges is really endless, but that's an exciting challenge for me as someone who always strive to find interesting things in every culture that I encounter. So I think this was a perfect fit for me in that sense.
So you mentioned something there I want to hit on, which is the different values that different cultures have these different values and how those can impact or come into play in the workplace. Can you just tell us a little bit about that and how you've seen that for yourself, how you've seen that play out, maybe with employees who are from different places in the world or come from these different cultural backgrounds? And how those values impact everyday interaction or how you have to manage people differently.
Absolutely. And first of all, just a disclaimer, when we hire people for our company, we are looking somebody who can share our company's values, like globalism, like exceeding expectations and always learning. Those are our values. But when I talk about values in the workplace, for example, one example would be some cultures, like United States, for example, tends to be very individualistic focused, right? We take each employee as a person and look at that, what their needs are. And the needs could be absolutely different. In countries like Mexico, the collective value, collective meaning the team that works together can overshadow the individualistic value. So people tend to think about how is this for my team versus how is it for me? So it doesn't mean that their individualistic values don't matter. It just means that the way that culture operates, they're just more collective focused. So that would be one example, dealing with different values in the workplace. Something that we can see as an extra thing, an unnecessary thing, can be viewed by folks as a benefit.
So I think what's really interesting about that is, and especially from, I always like to bring the neuroscience perspective, is that as we grow up, as we live our lives, as we have our experiences, our neural pathways are formed. The ways that we experience and see the world shape how we perform and exist in the world. And so if I've grown up in a culture like we talked about that values the team, that really values the community or the group that you're a part of, in a way that is more, maybe more important than my individual values. Like, I'm gonna put the greater good of the team above my own meeting my own needs. That experience, that life experience has literally changed or wired how those individuals see the world and experience the world. And so as you talk about those values in the workplace and then how they come into the workplace and then how individuals see those as benefits, you can begin to see how different perspectives or life experiences are really going to create different reactions to the same situation or the same workplace. And it's not necessarily that anyone's choosing that culture. It's literally that they've been wired that way, that they have developed those patterns or those ways of being because of where they lived. One of the examples I often refer to is in Japan, there's a lot of focus on or a lot of value placed upon taking care of the elderly members of the community and deference to that wisdom and appreciation for their value and contributions. And I often contrast that a little bit with here in the United States. Not that we don't value our older members in the society, but maybe not as much, and it's not as significant, and you can see it in the actions that we take and in how we maybe treat different generations or how we interact, and those become just ways that we experience the world, and sometimes it's hard to even recognize those cultural differences because we're living in our own cultural experience. I like to think of it, the fish swimming in the fishbowl or the fish swimming in water. It's hard to see the water when you're swimming in the water when it's just your experience. So I'm curious, what are some of the common challenges that your managers or leaders might deal with, or managers or leaders in general might deal with when they're having to manage these diverse cultural backgrounds? And what can they do, or what have you seen them do that helps them to overcome those challenges?
That's a great question. The challenges are endless, like I mentioned before. But if we just focus on, say, management of multicultural teams, so the challenges come from everything of how person prefers to receive feedback. How do they show up to the meetings? What is in their head when they show up to one-on-ones, right? What are they comfortable sharing? What are they not comfortable sharing? How direct or indirect they are? What context of the culture they're coming from? How do they perceive authority? All those things are extremely important. In some cultures, the authority is never questioned, including the culture that you mentioned, Japan. Some cultures, like in US, we feel more at liberty a lot of times to question certain decisions in the workplace. And we feel free to do that because that's the culture that we live in. And in our company, I think that's a very valid challenge when the manager comes from one culture and then you have a team consisting of people different culture and you a lot of times get a totally different feedback during one-on-ones or performance reviews Or example could be if there's something on the mind of the employee, and they do have opportunity to say it, but because of their cultural upbringing, they might not feel comfortable sharing it. So our job is to create that space of comfort, create a space of trust to really understand what are your needs in the workplace. So that would be like one of the challenges I could think of.
I love that. I think that's so applicable in so many scenarios, and you can see how an individual's cultural upbringing that maybe makes it difficult to speak up to authority or to address issues going wrong could be really problematic in a workplace scenario where a leader or manager thinks or their experience is if something's wrong, someone will tell me. They'll bring it up to me. They'll come talk to me. I tell them I have an open door policy. I tell them they can speak up. But if my whole life cultural experience, if my all of my neural pathways tell me that I should defer to authority, I should, if they say this is what I should do it and not challenge it, that makes it really difficult for them to speak up, for them to do something that's outside their normal way of operating. What are some ways to that leaders or what are some things that leaders might do to encourage that communication or to make create opportunities for people to be able to speak their mind or to address issues or things like that? Are there things that they can do?
I think the first most important thing is that we have to constantly be learning. So I'm trying to learn more as I work more with different cultures, and I'm in no way presenting myself as a cultural expert. But number one is to have curiosity and to get in the situation, analyze the situation, understand why is this happening and what can I do? So what can you do as a leader, as a manager? You can pick up a communication book on this particular culture. There's plenty of information available. You can go on websites, you can watch videos if you prefer video format on how different cultures operate, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, if you prefer content in a video form or a podcast. So there's definitely plenty of resources available to the topic. Of course, you can always pick up your suitcase and head over and visit the office where your company is, if you have an office in the country. For example, this summer I spent a month in Mexico City just because I wanted to work side by side with my Mexican colleagues. So that helped me a lot to not only improve my Spanish, but also understand their pain points and their daily life from that perspective.
So I think that's so powerful, and I love that you talked about learning and you highlighted taking the time to learn. One of my partners who works for Evolving to Exceptional is her family were refugees from Bosnia. And she's worked with me for 6 or 7 years now, but she started out as an intern, so she was still in college, lived at home, was very engrossed in Bosnian culture, still is. And that was a culture I didn't know anything about. I didn't have any exposure or understanding of. And so as I got to know her better and she's always been great about her willingness to share or to allow what I sometimes call this might be a silly question, but I really want to know. And so she's always ask all the silly questions because you don't know. And sometimes we can be scared as leaders to ask questions we don't know the answer to. But what I found in at least in my relationship with her is that when you give someone from a different culture the respect to ask the question, to say, "I don't know actually about your culture, and I really wanna know more. Can you tell me more? Can you help me with what this experience is like, or what your holiday is, or why you practice this particular religious background or this particular religious practice or experience?" As you learn about that, as you learn about that culture, it helps to develop that trust you were talking about. It helps to develop that relationship so that you can understand and gain perspective that you wouldn't ever be able to have unless you engage in those conversations and that learning.
Yeah, I want to add to another third point as you were talking, it popped up in my head regarding what can we do better. Another thing I've noticed in a lot of US based companies, we are so focused on our processes, efficiency, and things that worked here. And we're so confident that these things that worked here is going to work somewhere else. But that is a big fallacy that I've actually experienced myself. You'll almost feel like, oh, great, well, I know it's going to work somewhere else. But if you think about it, even McDonald's, when they're building locations across the globe, they have to adjust to the local cuisine, right? So they have dishes that people will buy because they can relate, not because they're just US, from US. So the same here. And you can't use one size fits all approach, and you have to stay flexible. You have to listen to people. You have to adjust your things, your processes, your ideas that you bring there. You have to adjust it to the local flavor. I would describe it that way.
I love that you brought that up. And I think part of that is allowing there to be space for that trust to develop or for those changes to be made, to be willing to say, okay, everybody's coming in with these different perspectives, these amazing human beings who've developed and grown based on different cultures and different experiences. And in some cases, that might bring a tremendous amount of value if you take the time to understand it, if you make the space for it. And I think you're right. Oftentimes, not just in applying the processes in other countries, but also we get so stuck on the processes that we don't make space and time for the understanding or gaining of perspective from the people that are going to apply or use those in another country or in another culture. And when we don't do that, when we don't understand that, and we take for granted that it'll work the same way or that they'll think and use it the same way, then we actually do a disservice to our business and the effectiveness of the work that we're doing.
Absolutely. We have to be mindful of every single thing we do overseas or multicultural workforce that are maybe not familiar with US approach. We have to analyze how we give feedback, how we show up to work, how we greet them. Every single detail in some cultures matters. It sounds complicated, but the world is complicated.
What I think is so interesting is it's when we think about us as human beings, we're all created differently. And really, how people receive feedback or how they communicate and all of those things can vary from person to person, regardless of if you're in the same culture or not, or the same country or not. And what having this conversation about cultural differences really does is highlights the most extreme examples, are the most obvious examples of where this exists, but at a not but and on a fundamental level, it exists in every scenario. The more that we can understand the individual human that we're working with, and their needs and how they operate and how they experience the world, understanding and learning about cultures can help and can get us in the ballpark to understanding a perspective or a human experience. And I feel like we also have to get down to the individual, because just because somebody grew up in a culture doesn't mean that they're always going to associate the with those results. And you could almost get yourself into the opposite effect of generalizing that everybody in the US culture it does this, or everybody in this culture is this way. And so the more we can learn individually about the humans that we're interacting with, the better the results, the better the outcome. So I love the like it highlights the issue, and the more individualized we can be, the better the results that we're going to get.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I was talking about my points, I was mainly focusing on companies that have, say, global offices somewhere else. But of course, in US, we have a huge amount of immigrants and multicultural people that grew up here and people that moved here a long time ago. So we have a huge variety of folks to work with. And again, we can apply the same principles. If you have a super diverse workforce that is coming from different cultures, would you really throw like American 1970s sports trivia event or like a celebrity trivia for someone who hasn't even lived here in the 70s.
Oh,
So
such a good point.
those things are very popular, right, to do. But that would not necessarily engage the people in your workplace. So everything has to be tailor-made and custom made.
So let's dive into that a little bit further because I'm curious about what are some of the ways that, and I love that like real life example there of trivia. What are some ways or things that workplaces or organizations can do or how they can create cultures where people feel like they can bring their cultural identity. They feel like they can show up as themselves and be able to accommodate kind of those different cultural norms. So what are the things that workplaces can do, and that could be just cultural things or it could be in policies or practices or things that they need to actually implement to ensure that you're accommodating for those norms and those values.
Yeah, absolutely. For global companies, I think first most important thing, and I will go back to my point previously, is curiosity. So, what does that mean? It means that even prior to opening an office or hiring people in the chosen country or hiring people from specific background, not knowing anything about this background, you have to do your research. And doing research, step one, asking questions. Step two, getting to know your employees. What do they like? What are their preferences? Empowering your managers to have formal and informal opportunities to ask these questions. It could be anything of, do you prefer in person? Do you events or do you prefer online? Finding out their personal situation, finding out their previous experience, finding out what they like. It's just constant conversation that has to keep going. And obviously keeping in mind how open, again, going back to the culture point, how open people are about it. Number two would be just researching what other companies are doing. We live in the world of information. Luckily, there's a ton of resources out there for specifically HR practitioners. There's professional communities, there's chats, there's free online resources, there's organizations that you can get involved and get help, get resources if you're working on compliance or if you're working on recruiting, or if we're talking about engagement and building culture. There's a ton of case study available. You can find someone in those communities that represent that particular culture and become friends or professional buddies with them. And you can use them as a resource, right? It pays to have friends from all these backgrounds because you can always have these conversations with them.
I love what you talked about there, and the first part when you in highlighting preferences, I think is something that organizations can do that's really typically pretty low cost and high return, really valuable. And we talk about in a lot of our programs when it comes to preferences, people's strengths or talents, their values, their interests, their motivations, their capabilities, their experiences, their beliefs, understanding those things about an individual, especially if you're their leader or their manager, can go a long way to navigating and overcoming any of the cultural hurdles that we talked about because you can learn about them specifically and you can learn about some of the things that really matter or impact them, tailor or customize your approach based on that. And we use Gallup Strengths Finder. Everybody in our team is a certified Gallup Strengths coach. And one of the things that Gallup talks about in their strengths assessment and the talent results that they do globally all over the world is that they see different patterns in those strengths by country. There are, when you break it down by country, there are certain strengths that come up more often in US culture, and it varies from another country's culture. And I think that's a really clear indicator of the cultural differences because it's not just an individual person, but overall that culture produces more of this talent or has this tendency. And when you do those assessments and you look at those preferences, you can really get at and understand people at on an individual level and understand what their needs are and their values and how they work. And I think that can create a lot of relationship building for people as well. between coworkers, because now you've got a language to talk about or address those differences and a context to have those conversations rather than trying to carve out time of a regular day. And how do we talk about what's different? Most people don't carve out a podcast to have this conversation. So how do they identify that or enter into those dialogues? And I think a talk about preferences might be a really good segue into some of those conversations.
I also want to make a point about new HR professionals in this space. And I'm not talking about brand new or somebody who just fell in the profession, but someone who is faced with a global company and multicultural teams um, coming from like a more local US approach, and they feel paralyzed. I've met several HR folks at a conference in New York that I went to in May. They need so much support, they need so much help, but their top leadership, unfortunately, is not knowledgeable enough to provide that help. So in this case, my advice would be to get a very proactive approach and not only dive into all the books and resources, but also advocate for yourself to attend these conferences, to attend these events, to, if you're HR1, to have this opportunity to connect with all these people. I think that there's a high chance that a company that wants to grow globally and wants to have competent HR leader who understands all these intricacies, I think there's a high chance that this request would get approved.
I think it's great advice, and I think often we can get really comfortable in our own bubbles of people that are like us, that look like us, that like the things that we do, behave like we do, but our greatest growth can come from expanding beyond that, from learning about new people, new perspectives, new experiences, and that's what really allows us to grow in terms of adult development, in terms of our self-awareness and our consciousness and our understanding of how what we do fits within the world. And so I think it's a really powerful bit of advice to those HR professionals out there to expand that skill set and expand your perspective and experiences in the world. And often, I think for HR people, like you indicated, true development for those in the HR, the talent space is hard to get within an organization because you're working for usually the CEO or the top executive, and they don't have the background or the skill sets that are really going to help you to develop the most. And so one of the things I always say I regretted the most as an HR practitioner was not getting external development sooner, was not getting more connections, more perspective, interacting and coaching from those outside my organization earlier in my career, because it can bring such value and it can bring such greater growth than when you're just within your own organization, which is probably true for a lot of individuals.
Yeah, we live in a time where if we don't set up to pursue something, it's just not going to fall from the sky, no matter what company, small or large, you work for. So you have to, like you said, you have to take development in your profession in your own hands. After all, these are going to be your accomplishments, your certificates, your classes, your conferences. You put it all in one folder. You shouldn't forget to keep track of everything that you've done, everything that you've learned. Because when you leave the company, you're going to take it with you. Maybe even if you're not leaving right now, but this, you're investing in yourself, right? So, and the good news is that a lot of these resources are free, are low cost, and companies are willing to pay for some of this. So, yeah, absolutely. Development is a must.
So I'm curious just in that space, and you may or may not have these resources, but I'm curious if there are resources or support or things that organizations that you're aware of that organizations can provide to employees to enhance that cross-cultural understanding and collaboration. If there are, sometimes there's so much information out there that it can be hard to know what to look at or where to start. There's like 100 programs. You're like, okay, which one should I take? There's a million courses out there. Is there anything in terms of resources or support that either you've used or you've come across that's really valuable and in helping people to identify how to get that growth and development?
Yeah, your question is about specifically cross-cultural development.
Yeah.
Okay. In my case, it's a little bit different because I've been in the international space since I moved to US. When I was 20, I got that knowledge from being in those circles with the people, working with immigrants, refugees, international students, being an international student myself. So I have firsthand experience in these things. So I didn't necessarily had to take any kind of formal courses. I've done formal courses in college on cross-cultural communications and things like that. I cannot recommend a resource on the top of my head, but I know that there are formal trainings, there are speakers that you can invite. For example, my former company, nonprofit that I used to work, we would have this monthly meeting where we had a multicultural workforce, and we would have a representative from this culture who would be like a employee, a volunteer, and they would come in and they would dedicate an hour talking about their culture and their beautiful country and what it has to offer and what we eat and how we communicate. And that was super neat and super engaging and interesting because everyone would walk out of these meetings learning something new, right? And people usually enjoy talking about things that they like, that they're attached to. So that is one very low cost solution that HR folks can use. Obviously, there's enormous amount of literature on each culture. I also am a bit skeptical on the formal courses just because if the course has to be developed not by an outsider, it has to be developed by somebody who lived it and who knows it, right? So, can you really be that person who knows everything and can write a book about it? Probably not. So, it has to be an individual approach, combination of watching, I don't know, some videos about a culture, the history of it, reading a book on business communication, talking to a person who represents this culture, inviting them for lunch, I don't know, provide opportunities for in person communication. Just, it's very proactive. It's very proactive approach.
I love the idea, and I love what you're saying there about the formal learning versus the actually having someone come and speak or inviting someone even within your own organization to share because like you said, that brings real experience, brings real perspective, lived experience rather than theoretical experience, and I think that can bring so much more value. And it's interesting as you're talking, I'm reflecting on my own past and leadership in the HR and talent management space and how easy that low cost option is to overlook and never take advantage of. We certainly had people from different cultural backgrounds that we never gave an opportunity or a platform for those individuals to maybe share about their experience or how they view things differently or how their cultural past may shape how they interact or how they communicate differently or in different ways. And I think I can also see where that potentially led to conflict and issues because we didn't address it, because we didn't recognize or pay attention to those differences. So I love that you brought up such a practical application and really all it takes is a willingness to make space for those communications to happen, for those opportunities to come up, and and all of that's gonna help build trust, right? All of that's gonna help build your culture, create a more inclusive and empowering culture, and can only bring value as you give people the platform to share their experience and perspective.
Yeah, another low cost thing that I've done with my teams, and I mentioned that I right now mainly work with US and Mexico. And with those two teams, there are some people from other cultures as well. So what I've done is I just created like a quiz and I threw it at the team virtual engagement, like where people had to answer questions about their own, about the opposite cultures, right? So US folks had to answer things about Mexico. Like I would give a picture of some obscure Mexican food and I would have to ask them, what is in the picture? Come on. And this opens up like this conversation where people are guessing, but then the other part is engaging and telling them all about this dish. So that's opportunity to connect and exchange cultures. And it doesn't cost anything.
I absolutely love that. I think it's a brilliant, easy, fun way to get people engaging and understanding each other. I'm curious a little bit about policies, procedures, things like that, practices that you have to really intentionally craft differently for different cultures or maybe countries where you really have to consider adapting. Certainly, for example, I would think in a lot of cases you would have maybe different holidays, a different policy around holidays or what the holidays are in one country versus maybe another country based upon their practices and their culture. Are there other policies or practices that come to mind that you really want to make sure or pay attention to crafting differently to accommodate different cultures?
I think that's a very important question, and a question that most likely HR practitioners that work in global spaces, they struggle with the most unless they have some very solid advisors in those countries or they use like global PO services. Um, I've certainly struggled with. I have to be involved in payroll processes for both countries, and I found that in the US, it's pretty easy to find a solution there to find a solution that provides you with the payroll service and everything is transparent and you know what to expect. In Mexico, I had to learn from scratch and still learning all the processes and how complex their tax system is and how many different variables are there and how complex the whole payroll system is. So that is an ongoing challenge. That's regarding the payroll. Regarding the policies, I think you have to come from a perspective of the local law. Number one, again, you as much as you wanted to use the same handbook you have in US that took you like several months to develop, you cannot just copy that handbook and bring it to the new country because and guess what? The laws are different. So I am currently actually working on that particular aspect and specifically in Mexico because people are also very resourceful and people will challenge you and they will say that in our country, the law works this certain way and they expect certain things according to the law. For example, in Mexico, they have vacation premium, what they call it's something that we don't have. It's something that you pay outside of the paid time of vacation. So you have to pay a 25%, I believe, of the vacation pay, of the salary, I'm sorry, of the salary when a person goes on vacation. And vacations are regulated according to the year that you work in a company. After you work 6 years, you automatically get 22 days of vacation. So they have a table each person, and it's regulated by the government. We definitely don't have that here in US. So yeah, you have to go from the law perspective, but then you can always take what you have, local law perspective, and adjust um, to the country you're operating in.
Yeah, and I can see how that could create challenge as well, where maybe people get certain benefits in some countries that they might not get in other countries. Certainly, maternity leave in the US is not what it is in a lot of other countries. And there may be differences or frustrations that come out of those differences. And so paying attention to, I imagine, how you put together those policies in a way that creates fairness to the best extent possible or to the most extent possible is probably really important for y- keeping cohesion in terms of workplace culture and how people feel about how the company or organization is treating them in one country versus another. Would is that has that been your experience?
You bring up the word that's always on my mind. What is fair? What is just, right? And that's coming from nonprofit world and then caring about people and having a high sense of empathy. You know, it just you come to realize after working in HR, you can do your best. You can do your 100% best. And you can follow all the procedures, all the laws. If you have a global company, things will not be equal for everyone in these countries, no matter how hard we try, because number one, you're always going to have the pay disparity. People are paid different amounts in different countries in that sense, because the standard, the quality of life, the living, the market is just different. And that's the reality. You can try to do your best. You can create those workplaces. You can have the policies that apply to everyone. There will always be some type of issue that's different or that's impossible to accomplish. It's a very complex issue for me first.
Yeah, it's interesting. Growing up, one of the things that I remember my parents teaching me or instilling in me is that life isn't fair, and that the world isn't fair, that things don't come out, aren't always fair. And I think that's true. I think that's absolutely true. And that is the case. And I think oftentimes we confuse fairness with equal, as you bring up the equal component. And fairness doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's treated equally or everyone gets the same thing. Fairness, really, when you look at the definition, it's impartial and just treatment or behavior without favoritism or discrimination. And so it's really about doing our best to treat people in a way that's fair and not favor or discriminate against others for a variety of reasons, for any type of reason. So we don't pay someone else more because of their gender, or we don't pay someone more because they live in or they're a US citizen versus another. There has to be a rational basis for the decisions that we make that is fair and appropriate. And I think we do live in a world that isn't fair, that has lots of discrimination and favoritism. And oftentimes people are not treated impartially or in a just way. And I think as HR professionals, we've got to strive for that whenever we can. Doesn't mean we're always going to be successful. It doesn't mean we can always accomplish it. But understanding that fairness doesn't mean equal. If cost of living is different, then pay may be different, but it should still be fair. It should still be fair in terms of what the cost of living is, or what a person's circumstances are, or what they need in a given situation. And I think that when we do that, when we behave in that way, we create better results for everyone. We create a better culture for everyone. So I agree with you. It's an incredibly complex issue, and it's one that comes up a lot and gets even more challenging as you're dealing with really different cultures and different experiences and different people in different countries. And how do you do that in a way that is effective? And so the best that we can do as HR people is just to do our best to be impartial and just, to do our best to do it without discriminating or creating favoritism.
Yeah, and I would add to thank you for reading that definition and the difference between fair and equal. It's very helpful. And I would add that if you find yourself, another tip for HR practitioners, if you find yourself in a constant conflict between what your company's decisions are, what your top management decisions are, and how your people feel and how they're treated, and you're stuck there in the middle, right? And want to improve, but you can't. And if you've been in that state for a long time, perhaps this is not the right place for you. Clearly, your values don't align. So don't be afraid to look out what's out there in the market, because there are a lot of great companies out there and great opportunities.
I think that's a really good point and really important for people to remember that if they're not valued, if they're especially their cultures and their experiences and their preferences and who they are, and they're really not able to show up as themselves, they're not able to bring that cultural identity to work, that's a huge energy expender. I always talk about when it comes to, again, our performance and the neurosciences of our performance is there's only so much time, but how we use our energy is really important. And when we have to work in a place where we have to hide or change or adjust parts of ourselves, we are expending unnecessary energy doing so. And so if you can look for or find an organization where you can bring that identity, where you can show up as who you are, you're going to get more energy back, which is going to improve your overall life experience, your journey, all of the things that you think about when it comes to being able to live a better life, being able to have a better experience. And so it's important to recognize that masking or covering or trying to ignore those differences can do harm on a lot of different levels. And so paying attention to and recognizing that and saying it's worthwhile to look for somewhere else, I think is a really important, I think you raise a really important issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I have just loved this conversation, Lilia. You bring such perspective given your own experience coming to this country and your own background, as well as working with people of all these different cultures and working in immigration for all the years that you did, and getting to see this firsthand and raising an issue that I think people recognize, but don't always get creative in finding solutions to or taking action on. So I think it's just a really valuable topic. I want to give you a chance to give any final thoughts, insights, anything you'd like to share with our audience before we wrap up this episode.
A lot of questions that I get from my HR peers is maybe my last word would be focused on those who are really looking to work in the global HR field and are looking for some resources, what to do. They can certainly reach out to me. I'm happy to provide any kind of advice or guidance or connect you with anyone who I know because I do have a lot of connections in different spaces all across the world, and I'm happy to chat about what companies are good global companies to work for, how to make it in the global HR, or how to move forward if you feel stuck. In addition, the advice for companies that are dealing with multicultural workforce, I hate to say multicultural issues because it's not something that's temporary, right? It's to stay. I think that going back to my first point, start with the curiosity. Notice your things that you're doing right now that are not working or that are not perceived. Ask your multicultural teams or people in general, ask for feedback after every single event. If it's a barbecue or if it's a virtual engagement or a guest or a 1970s sports trivia, ask for feedback and see that the details are in that feedback. People are open to share. And if the things that you are doing right now, if they're not working, and have that willingness to change and step out of your box, step out of the box, step out of your comfort zone, hiring some experts, inviting people to help you to raise that engagement because the truth is the world is getting more global and more connected and more diverse, and United States is a pioneer in this space. So let's just keep the momentum going.
I love it. All of it is fantastic advice for everybody out there that is dealing with these challenges. And the truth is, whether your workplace is a global workplace or not, whether you represent multiple countries or not, you certainly have a variety of cultures within your workplace. And just because someone lives in this country or in your country doesn't mean that they don't have a different cultural background or upbringing or experience. And if we can become aware of and really appreciate the humanness of human beings and the experiences and the value of all those experiences and how they have shaped that person, that individual human into the being that they are. And all of those experiences, all of those preferences, all of those talents, values, interests, motivations impact our workplaces on a daily basis in all of our interactions and in all of our experiences and in everything that we do. And so rather than ignoring or pretending they don't exist, by purposefully and intentionally engaging and talking about and addressing and paying attention to them, we can actually not overcome them, but instead integrate them in a way that brings value, in a way that helps us to work together more effectively, communicate better, interact better, and create better results for individuals and the business overall. So I think this is an incredibly important issue. If you are not addressing preferences, if you're not talking about these different backgrounds and experiences, if you're ignoring or pretending as though everyone is the same, you are missing out on a tremendous opportunity and a tremendous amount of value that you can bring both to the people within your workplace and to your organization overall. As we wrap up this week's episode, I want to thank you, Lilya, for joining us. I want to thank our audience for listening. And as always, I want to remind you to just always keep evolving, keep growing, keep transforming your neural pathways, keep looking for those opportunities to enhance your experiences so that you can live your best life possible, so that you can enjoy all the experiences you have on your life's journey and ultimately live your truly exceptional life. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and week, and we will be back next week with another episode.